Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for showing interest in joining this session. We will spend the following hour cheating time. My name is Jacob, and I work as a data scientist at Bayer, and I will host this session together with my colleague Isa. At Bayer, we work on a wild variety of use cases. However, for today's session, we are mixing it up. We will use examples from popular culture to get across what we work on and how we do so. And at the very end, we will probably shed some light on the similarities between the presented work and our day-to-day work. And to start, let's talk about a book. Back in 2008, the Canadian journalist Malcolm Gladwell published this book, Outliers: Story of Success. In this book, examines the to high levels of success, like what does set the best professional athletes, the top achieving business people, and the most accomplished musicians apart. Repeatedly mentions the 10,000 hour rule, which simplified states that a person could become an expert in any field as long as they were willing to devote the requisite 10,000 hours to studying and practicing the subject or skill. 10,000 hours. A fantastic, round, and very memorable number. And when hearing this, my mind immediately started to wonder about what things or skills I already have put 10,000 hours in, which in turn immediately forced me to think about the next thing, namely, exactly how long is 10,000 hours? So let's break it down just to get a sense of how much time we're actually talking here, because honestly, when working on this lecture, I had no intuitive idea of how much this actually is. So let's break it down. Let's do some back of the envelope calculation to get an intuition on how long this actually is. So let's start with my job. Am I an expert at what I do at work? 10,000 hours, the 8-hour workday on actually improving your key skill, be that something else. And using this guesstimate, 10,000 hours turns into 2,000 working days. And say that, sticking with this back of the envelope reasoning, an average year has about 200 working days. Then all of a sudden, we arrive at a more associable 10 years of working to become an expert in your specific field. Now, if I wanted to cheat time, yes, that is what I want to do always. If I want to be an expert sooner, then I see basically two dials I can turn. I can work more hours in a day, or I can work more days in the year. And sadly, neither of these things is something that I'm particularly looking forward to. So it will be at least 10 years before I'm an expert at what I do in my job. But what about other subjects? Where can I be an expert in? What about activities for my private life? Can one become an expert, say, in podcasts? Well, surely, if one would listen to 10,000 hours worth of podcasts, then they would be regarded as the source for anything podcasts among their group of friends, their relatives, their colleagues. They would be a walking encyclopedia on anything podcast. They would deserve a platform. They would be able to teach people how to make podcasts. They would know what topics have been extensively covered and which not. They would be perfect on guiding you what to listen to, which genres there are. They would truly be an expert. Well, this could be something for me because I listen to podcasts. And there even was a time not so long ago where I truly devoured them. I really did. I was on parental leave. I just had my second child and spent hours and hours every day of every week walking through the parks in my neighborhood with a sleeping baby in a carrier and headphones over my ears. And it didn't matter whether it was raining cats and dogs or whether there were weather alarms associated with heavy winds, I would be making my rounds. Every single day, every single week between 12 and 2, I was out and about. So maybe I am already a certified expert on podcasts. Let's check whether I got my 10,000 hours in back to the back of the envelope. So 10,000 hours for 2 hours a day. So then 10,000 hours turns into 5,000 days, which turns into about 14 years. Well, this is way too long because 14 years ago, podcasts were barely even a thing. So definitely using this reasoning, I cannot be an expert already. And presumably I need quite a couple more years to be an expert. But what about cheating time? Is there a way that I can become an expert sooner in less than 13 years? Well, I cannot listen more days a year. I can only listen more hours a day. But for those of you familiar with podcasts, there's another way to cheat time. There's another dial I can turn here, because with podcasts, I can alter the speed with which I'm listening. So yes, when it's on regular 1.0 speed, it takes me 14 years. But on 1.4 speed, I would be done in 10 years. So if I push this even more, at 2.8 speed, it's only 5 years. Now 5 years, this is doable. I'm probably already 50% there, solely thanks to the possibility to turn the speed dial, possibility to accelerate, the possibility to cheat time. I can become an expert in record time. I guess you might already refer to me as a semi-expert. Let's have a quick look at a small snapshot of podcasts I'm intimately familiar with. Obviously, I've extensively covered podcasts on UK-based popular culture, Dutch shows on sports, where I'm from, official post-episode discussions on the biggest Western TV shows and topics associated with my line of work. And surely there are still many untapped wells of content for me. However, I'm confident that I can entertain anyone with my vast knowledge of these, and I still have to meet the first person that doesn't see anything of their taste in this snapshot.
So, well, look no further, Jacob. After a quick glance at the podcast that you are showing us, it's clear that there is a bit of a mismatch. I know none of these. And I also think that you forgot that our audience is primarily Polish. And hence, it's likely that the podcast you are into might not fully align with what's popular in Poland. I mean, the effort is impressive, but it looks like we are tuning into different frequencies, quite literally. So for our Polish audience, it's hard to refer to you as a semi-expert in the podcast that actually resonate with us. Like, no, don't get me wrong. It's about bridging that gap and maybe, just maybe, expanding your horizons a little bit. So what about we dive into the bigger podcasts here in Poland? And what about we further accelerate your learning to really start cheating time? I'm talking about more than just accelerating the speed with which we listen to our podcasts, but I'm talking about changing the whole game. You see, speeding up playback is one thing, but understanding the content of the podcast itself, especially in Polish, it's completely different thing. And here is where it gets interesting. We can look into using transcription tools. They are pretty much all around us these days. On YouTube videos, they can be used to create live subtitles in multiple languages. In video calls, you can use them to automatically capture everything that was said in a text. Using such transcription tools, which allows us to turn from audio to written text, would be a game changer, especially considering how packed our schedules are during today's webinar. It's not about listening faster, it's about engaging deeper with the podcast content. So let's briefly look at 4 of the more popular podcasts in Poland. I guess you don't know any of this, Jacob, am I correct?
You're absolutely right. I've never heard of these. Who's the guy on the top right?
Top right. So this guy is host of Kryminatorium, which is true crime podcasts, and he delves into the world of crime and misery, and is actually based on real stories. Next one, also true crime, is Sonder, bottom left, and it's also based on real stories, a little bit different than Kryminatorium, but they are quite similar. Interesting one is top left, which is Żurnalista, which translates as journalist talk, and it's featured by quite controversial anonymous author interviewing well-known figures from Polish podcasts, show business, and many others. And lastly, actually, personal favorite of mine, Ja i moje przyjaciółki idiotki, which roughly translate as Me and My Friends Idiots, in which host Joanna Okuniewska talks about her and her friends' funny stories associated with dating, especially failures and common awkward moments. So you don't know any of this, but let's make next 30 minutes all about making you an expert in those podcasts. Okay, so now we know something about podcasts that we will work with. So let's get back to cheating time. First of all, listening to audio takes a lot of time and it makes it challenging to kind of revisit any particular part that was interesting. As an example, just last week, I met up with a friend of mine who said that she was feeling really down about her relationship. She told me that basically her boyfriend had been jobless for a while and didn't even seem interested in finding something new. Everything was falling on her shoulders now. The first thing that I was thinking when she mentioned this was, wait a minute, this guy behaves exactly like that guy from that episode from the Okuniewska podcast Ja i moje przyjaciółki idiotki. Someone who is only taking without giving anything in return. Like naturally, I wanted her to listen to it, but I just couldn't remember which episode it was. When I got home that evening, rather than going to bed immediately, I spent around 2 hours scrolling through episodes and trying to find that episode. And when I finally got it, I sent it to her, the link, in the middle of the night. This whole situation would have been completely different if I had access to transcripts or access to written text rather than audio. If I would have that, I could have just done with a simple Control F. And I would have been done in like 1 minute or so. Making such transcript, of course, takes absolute ages to do this manually. First, I would have to listen to 10 seconds of podcasts. Second, write down what was said, then play the next 10 seconds over and over again. But here I see option to really cheat time, because now there are tools available to do this for you automatically, open source, and on your own machine in any language with breathtaking accuracy. Most notably, there is the library Whisper by OpenAI. And just to show you how easy it is and how impressive the results are, let's transcribe episode of Ja i moje przyjaciółki idiotki podcast together. First of all, this is the code that I use to run this on my machine. Just these 4 lines, that's all. Now, let's see the results, and especially for you, Jacob, and maybe for other non-Polish listeners, I have added a live translation as well. So this is truly remarkable. First of all, I have this instantly, and the accuracy is basically perfect. And to reiterate, this is open source software running locally on my machine. So, for the remainder of this lecture, we will work a specifically created database with transcript of Polish podcasts. We transcribed around 100 hours of episodes coming from these 4 podcasts, which equals to, say, 1,000 pages of written out Polish texts. And as Jacob mentioned in his introduction, during this webinar, we use Polish podcasts for exemplary purposes, but it requires only literal imagination on how this could apply to business-related data. More on that at the end of this lecture. So, we initially just created a transcript, and this doesn't equate to knowledge or value. It opens the door to knowledge or value, but currently it is just the same stuff in a different format. Now, what can we do with it to really generate knowledge or value? Well, as almost every answer in these days to such question, we could use large language models on this dataset. And using such large language models, such as ChatGPT, the first thing that comes to mind is creating a short summary of the episode. So let's do this for the episode of the podcast Ja i moje przyjaciółki idiotki that I mentioned before. I have attached a transcript of an episode from this podcast here. Okay, so the prompt goes, please provide a short summary for this episode. And so this podcast is actually the one that I really like listening to because it's funny and also gives good advice, especially about dating. And this specific episode about so-called crocodiles or people exploiting their partners really caught my attention. Not only was it a perfect fit for my friend's situation, but presumably many of us can relate at some level. Remembering this episode makes me think of an idea I had back then. When I was chatting with my friend, I thought that it would be great to have a list of dating warning signs and red flags from the stories shared in the podcast. And not only is that a great idea, but it also elevates us in terms of extracting knowledge from these audio sources. A summary provides helpful information, but this truly creates something new out of it. This is something that could constitute value. By focusing on gathering a collection of warning signs, we enhance our understanding and the usefulness of these data sources. When it comes to cheating time, and for these purposes and simplicity, let's stick with just a subset of 10 episodes, which equals to around 9 hours of audio. Even if I sped through them at 2.8 speed, it would still take more than 3 hours of hyper-concentrating listening. But with these transcripts, we can speed up this process and can cheat time by a factor of 300 times having large language models analyze them for us. This approach not only saves time, but also ensures we don't miss out on valuable insights. By using the language model's capabilities, we can quickly get a detailed list of warning signs in dating, which can then be shared and widely used by anyone before a date or as a reminder in longer relationship. So here we have our results. And again, this transforms hours of listening into a brief, informative list, making the process both efficient and effective. And the best part, all of this was created in just 10 seconds, not 3 hours. Now, if I scan those warning signs and think about the other podcasts we have transcribed, these signs really stand out, especially dishonesty, which caught my attention as something from the world of true crime podcasts. About them, we have not one, but 2 true crime podcasts in our dataset, Sonder and Kryminatorium. Considering how well large language models are at extracting information, maybe let's take it a step further and ask GenAI for a more complex analysis. Not just a summary or accumulation, but also understanding criminals. A key thing we might wonder about is why criminals do what they do. What are their motives? Understanding these motives is crucial, and this isn't just true for crime stories. In business, for example, figuring out why people act a certain way can be very insightful. Why they prefer one brand over another. Why do people do the things they do? Let's dive into this Sonder podcast for some answers. Just a reminder, we have lots and lots of this type of data. Just the text that is being spoken in the podcast. And this is the source for our large language models to investigate. So next prompt, what are the main characteristics and motives of our criminals in Sonder episode? And here, by looking at our answer at criminal characteristic and motives, we are doing kind of a criminal research here. And as a result of the prompt, we are easily gathering detailed information about each person, and we receive an in-depth overview of the criminals at the same time. This information isn't just found word for word in the transcription. The model learned it through in between lines from the situation description. Okay, so what's next for our criminal research? We move to level 3. Here, we take what we've learned from Sonder and apply it to another podcast, Kryminatorium. We are basically asking, how do the lessons from Sonder fit with stories in Kryminatorium? This way, we are not just learning from one set of stories, but we are linking our insights to another, broadening our understanding of criminal motives and actions across different scenarios, evaluating how characteristics and motives from one podcast carry over to another. Like, are the types of criminals in one podcast virtually identical to them in another? Okay, so now we are receiving our clusters of criminals based on their reason and backgrounds, like bad experiences, wanting to fix wrongs, or having mental health troubles. We have several types of criminals here, from those acting out of revenge or because they have a deep personal issues, to those tricking others for a cause of a personal reasons, and even those affected by society mistakes. It shows that crime usually comes from a complicated mixture of personal issues, mental health, or social issues. But also, it provides us with insights when it comes to what type of criminals we meet more often in one podcast over another. In a way, it might teach us very intricate details that differentiate the audiences or creators of this podcast. So we know that we can dive really deep into transcript data, not only by summarizing retrieved text, but also by deriving conclusions or by creating new content value. From podcast examples, we have already seen some interesting use cases that could be easily transferred into business scenarios. A very good example would be, say that we are interested in advertising in one of all of these podcasts. What can the transcription, together with the LLM's knowledge of people, tell us about where to advertise them? What we would need to know is what type of person would tune into these stories, and in addition, decide what would be a good campaign or product to market there. Okay, so here is a question, and here we have an answer. Starting with ja i moje przyjaciółki idiotki. It's clear that the target audience here is young women between 20 and 35, all about empowerment and looking up to influencers. Hence, the type of marketing, but also the type of product, presumably really depends on this. Like advertisements of products aimed at older people or using a very formal tone wouldn't really catch on. As a buyer, there would be products that we might want to advertise to such an audience, and there are many products that wouldn't make any sense. Whereas Sonder and Criminatorium, the target age group is slightly older. Our target audience here is more likely to be people who enjoy challenges, puzzles, and a certain sense or what is right and what is wrong. The tone of advertisement should be more formal, the type of product more middle life related. And lastly, the journalist. And even more mature audience is recognized, and even more formal tone might be required. Like all of this is just to get your mind going, but learning about, in this case, a target audience will be instrumental in deciding how and what to communicate with them. So, Jacob, we just spent slightly less than 30 minutes talking about Polish podcasts. And as you know, we now also have access to all these podcasts. If you would take the time, you would be an expert on dating do's and don'ts in a matter of a minute. If you would like to learn about character traits or major criminals, I already have you covered. If you are interested in what the current topics in the major news are in Poland, just ask a journalista with a single prompt. This really allows you to cheat time, 100 hours worth of audio at your fingertips to answer any question you might have about them.
And now, as mentioned in the beginning and also repeatedly by Isa, before you misunderstand, we at Bayer sadly are not listening to podcasts all day, every day. We just pick this type of audio shows to be more appealing and interesting to a general audience. And this in many ways makes me think of the 2012 film Life of Pi that I only saw once back then in the cinema. So don't be too harsh on me misremembering things. But and why I'm telling you all of this, well, from what follows in my recollection in this film is a thrilling 100-minute action and emotion-packed roller coaster in which the main character, Pi, needs to survive, negotiate, and improvise to make life manageable on the lifeboat. And all the way at the end of the film, it is revealed to the audience that all these animals were actually like symbolic representations of people who were on the ship. The hyena represents the ship's cook, who was also quite aggressive and selfish, and the zebra, a sailor who Pi met on the ship, and both the zebra and the sailor were portrayed as vulnerable and innocent beings. And what I got out of this is by telling the story with the animals rather than with the people they represented, the story was more enjoyable and in a weird way, more relatable. And that is basically what we strive to achieve here. We were discussing podcasts for the sake of enjoyment and recollection, but all of the examples that Isa mentioned can be directly linked to business challenges. For example, say that there are keynote speeches at health summits that are recorded, then rather to listening to these keynote lectures, or even in addition to listening to it, having the audio transcribed and summarized and possibly emerging trends identified could really speed up our decision making and understanding. Or similarly, when it comes to understanding consumer needs or things they are annoyed or satisfied with, listening to hours and hours of focus group audio might mean that we miss overarching patterns or misidentify possible opportunities. Understanding different types of consumers that come forward in those focus groups, possibly clustering them, and subsequently identifying whether those clusters also exist in another market for another product in another country, could teach us what can be carried over and what needs to be created from scratch. Like, the possibilities are virtually endless. Having transcribed audio and the power of large language models allows us to interrogate audio sources. And now really working with the combination of technologies really opens our eyes into opportunities to applications every day. We are super excited for exploring how to best use them, to think of new ways or places to apply them, and to extract value from places that we previously considered not worth pursuing due to the inherent amount of work of listening to all of it again. And we sincerely hope that after joining this webinar, you might also feel inspired and copy the 4-line code snippets that Isa shared and just start transcribing and exploring yourself, finding new ingenious ways to extract value even from the most unlikely sources. So thank you so much for joining this webinar and watching it all the way through until the end. Thank you.